A lot of people, including myself, think that there's something special about science. There's a lot of ways of coming up with beliefs about the world, and not all of them seem to have the kind of secret something that science has. You could gain knowledge through divine revelation, or meditating in a cave for 20 years, or eating weird mushrooms. All of these are ways of coming up with at least beliefs, if not knowledge. Science seems to be different from all those in some way, and we might ask ourselves, if you believe that too, what is it that makes science different than other ways of generating knowledge? And one tempting answer is that science produces objective knowledge because it's in some sense free of things like human values and human subjectivity. So that's the question we're going to talk a little bit about today. And the answer that we're going to explore is one given by Frederick Grinnell in this book, The Everyday Practice of Science. Grinnell's going to argue that saying that science is objective in some straightforward way is too quick and too simple. He's going to argue that a straight yes or no answer to this question, is science objective, misses on a lot of the nuance and complexity of the scientific method. Actually, it misses out on some of the most exciting and interesting parts of the scientific method. So he's worried that people have actually been sold a version of the scientific method that makes it look very simple and very straightforward. And what he's going to do in these first few chapters is to try to identify the picture that he thinks people have been taught and been sold as a picture of science, and to try to complexify that for us a little. He's going to try to make us aware of the ways in which real science is more complicated than the picture that many of us have been offered. So he wants to call this oversimplified picture of science the linear model of science. So this is a story that people are very often told about how science works. Usually if you haven't got much time to tell the story. So if you were given a picture in elementary school or high school about how science works, or if you were just sort of absorbed it passively from the culture, this might be something like the story that you were told. And it goes something like this. Scientists go out into the world and they observe some stuff, and then they write it down and tell us what they observed. The end. And in this picture of science, basically, he calls it the linear model because in this picture, science is always adding knowledge. There's never taking knowledge away, right? So you're just adding knowledge to the pile, basically. Scientists are just sort of shoveling objective facts onto a big pile of knowledge, and the collection of scientific knowledge is just this big pile. That's going to turn out to be not quite complex enough to capture what actual science is like for a number of reasons. So for this linear model, the times that you might have been exposed to this include, for example, science fairs in elementary school or high school. I know I was made to do this. I really didn't like it. Something felt really weird about the science fair model, and I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. But Grinnell I was very happy to read Grinnell because he really articulated for me what's wrong with this picture. So if somebody made you do a science fair, they probably broke the scientific method down into the following steps. Okay, so you get a question, something that you're interested in. You have a hypothesis, so you make a guess about what the answer to that question is going to be, and then you do an experiment. You test your hypothesis somehow. Your experiment produces some data, and then you write those data down, you record your observations, and then you analyze the data somehow, and then build a report on that analysis. It's very straightforward. It's a very straightforward process in this picture. Some weird things about this picture. So for example, there's no clear reason why you need to have a hypothesis in this step-by-step process. Why don't you just skip step 2 here? Why don't you just have a question and then you do an experiment? It's not obvious what the hypothesis does here. Now, in the more complex picture of science that we'll talk about, the hypothesis actually does a whole bunch of work. But the story I just told you, it seems like a pointless step, doesn't it? Why would you try to come up with an answer before you've done the experiment? Why not do the experiment? So that's one thing that makes this a bit weird. Grinnell also thinks that it leaves out basically the most important part of actual science, the part that makes science potentially, to the degree that it is, a producer of objective knowledge. So the thing that this crucially leaves out is that, you're one slightly confused high school student trying to do a scientific experiment. You do your report, and that's the end of it, right? You do the report, they give you a mark, the end. So Grinnell thinks that that's really just the beginning of the scientific method. What makes science good at producing unbiased or maybe value-neutral knowledge is that it's part of, the end of this process is actually the beginning of another process. So this is the linear model of science. Grinnell is going to try to convince us that there's a better model, which he calls the two-conversation model. So here's an image of the two cycles of discussion that Grinnell thinks constitute real scientific practice. So this is his beginning of a more complex picture. So the linear model starts with the individual scientist going to the world and then coming back with some observations. And that's true. That, of course, scientists actually do that. Scientists come up with questions and then they create experiments and record the results of that experiment and they bring it back to the world and they make a report. So, of course, that's part of the story. But Grinnell wants us to notice that that's just the beginning of the story. So once a scientist has generated their experimental research report, what they do is put it out into a broader community. And the broader community, the community of research scientists in their field or in the sort of wider world, are going to evaluate that research report. And they're going to try to decide whether it's reliable, what its significance is, and so on. And the research community doesn't just sort of take the report and call it a day. They don't just put a mark on it like your teacher did and end the process. They then come back with either criticism or new suggestions or new experiments that then feed back to the individual scientist. And then the individual scientist then takes the response from the community and uses that to shape new experiments, new questions, and then goes back to the world. So both of these conversations are cycles, and all of these elements of the two conversations, the world, the individual, and the community, are all in constant communication with each other, reciprocal communication that informs both conversations. So, neither of these conversations, Grinnell's going to argue, are purely objective in the sense that they're unaffected by human interests and human values. So both the relationship between the individual and the world has some potential, values judgments built into it, and the relationship between the community and the individual also has some potential value judgments built into it. Despite the stereotype that scientists are sort of dispassionate, that observers of the natural world. They run the experiment and they're like, whatever it shows is what it shows, and I'm just going to accept, the results of my experiment. Grinnell says if you spend some time in a lab, you know that scientists aren't actually like that. And he doesn't think that makes them bad scientists. Quite the contrary. He thinks that kind of passion and enthusiasm and determination to find some result is really important to the process of science, especially the discovery phase, but also the community phase, where you have to, in some sense, market your idea to the broader community. You have to try to if you run the experiment, you've got the result, you have to then go to the community and with passion and energy, try to convince them that you're right. So in neither of those parts of the conversation, Grinnell thinks, is there pure objectivity in the sense of people just don't care what the result is. They just accept whatever the experiment says. They have no stakes in the process. Now, if you got the impression that scientific knowledge is basically value neutral, you might have gotten it from that science fair stuff. You might have also gotten it from the tone of your broader science education. So if you got some science education, I hope you got some, you probably started learning from textbooks. And textbooks do this funny thing that makes them very, very different from the actual cutting edge of science where new knowledge is being produced. So he wants us to notice, Grinnell wants us to notice the crucial differences between textbook knowledge and the cutting edge of scientific research. So he's going to take us through an example. Here's a really nice example of a textbook science fact. So the fact is something like this. You got some DNA, so every one of your cells has DNA in it, your genes. And what that DNA does is get transcribed into messenger RNA. Messenger RNA then gets fed into a ribosome. That ribosome then uses that information to build up a protein. Okay. If you're in molecular biology, you know this. I mean, this is just your ABCs, right? This is just the basic facts of molecular biology. If you're not in molecular biology, you might not have heard of this. You might not have followed that exactly. It doesn't matter. For our purposes, the point is, this is one of those super central facts in molecular biology. It's something that huge amounts of further research is based on. And when it's presented to you in a textbook, typically, maybe your textbook was different, but most textbooks just say, here it is, here's the fact. They don't tell you who came up with it. They don't tell you when. They don't tell you what the debate was like that generated it. So the textbook just gives you this bare fact. And when we're talking about the reliability or the objectivity of scientific facts, this one that DNA turns into RNA, turns into proteins, seems to me like one of the most reliable facts that we've got, right? It's got to be like if this turns out to be wrong, as they say, I'll eat my hat. This is just such a central idea that's been proven so many times and it really doesn't seem to matter what you care about, right? So the question of whether this fact is true is very reliable, but furthermore, it doesn't seem to matter what your values are. You could have totally opposite values to me. I still think you should believe this is true. So in some sense, this is a value-independent fact, right? So once it gets to the textbook stage, I don't really care what you care about. This is true. This is just a true fact. Okay, so that's the textbook version. That's what your science education was full of. It was full of these kind of facts they just look true, and there's nothing human about it. There's nothing about human values or human interests that seems to make a difference to this. However, let's now look at the process by which we actually arrived at this fact. So this was announced, this fact about DNA, RNA, proteins, was announced in this journal article. And this journal article has a pretty particular structure, like most journal articles do. So a journal article is another thing that contributes to the picture of the linear model of science. The journal article fits the linear model very, very well. It presents a very cleaned up version of the actual process of discovery. So the journal article actually reads like a lot like a science fair, doesn't it? So you've got a question, you've got their hypothesis, and then the description of their methods and their experiment, the explanation of the results, and conclusion based on those explanations. So the journal article, again, it looks a lot like the linear model of science. However, here's one of the authors of that paper. So Grinnell's quoting one of the authors of this paper where this textbook fact came from, was first announced to the public. So, writing a paper, wrote Nobel laureate Francois Jacob, one of the authors of the Nature paper, quote, is to substitute order for the disorder and agitation that animate life in the laboratory, to replace the real order of events and discoveries by what appears as the logical order, the one that should have been followed if the conclusions were known from the start. So when you publish a journal article, you don't write up all the times that you tried something and it didn't work. You don't publish all those experiments that just didn't show any kind of result at all. You publish the ones that actually produce a result of interest. And you don't publish things like the kind of feelings and emotions and commitment and dedication and passion that has to go into a successful scientific experiment. So Grinnell quotes a couple of little passages from the same people, the same research group describing what it was like to actually run this experiment. They say things like, quote, "We were to do very long, very arduous experiments, but nothing worked. We had tremendous technical problems." So rather than run an experiment and find that it didn't work and say, oh, well, who cares? That's just how science works. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Guess we'll move on. They tried again and again and again to make their experiment work. They said, quote, "Full of energy and excitement, sure of the correctness of our hypothesis, we started our experiment over and over again, modifying it slightly, changing some technical detail." I want you to particularly pick out the phrase, "sure of the correctness of our hypothesis." Now, they're doing the experiment that's supposed to prove that their hypothesis is true, but they're already sure that it's true. So they've got this kind of investment in their hypothesis. And again, Grinnell's not picking this out to criticize these people. He's holding this research group up as models of the ideal scientist. They produced this central textbook fact of molecular biology. They won Nobel Prizes. So they won the highest prize there is in science. These are not amateurs. These are not dilettantes. These are people at the very top of their game. But they're nonetheless deeply, passionately committed to their hypothesis. And you really need to be, is his argument. You really need to have this passionate commitment if you're going to make anything work in science. You can't just, the first time the experiment doesn't work, give up and go, oh, well, I guess we're wrong then. Right? That's not how science actually works in the real world, is his claim. And it doesn't work that way because very often an experiment doesn't work because it is some technical problem, right? It's not because your hypothesis was wrong. It's because you didn't set up the equipment quite right, or there's some interfering factor that you didn't think of. And it takes a bunch of energy, passion, and commitment to go through all those little technical glitches before you get at the truth. And sometimes, but keep in mind, you don't know what the truth is before you run the experiment. Not really. You're operating on the cutting edge of science. You're operating in that zone where we're trying to push back the boundaries of our knowledge. So you don't know actually for sure that you're right, but you have to go at it like you do know. And that's how scientific discoveries actually happen, not disinterestedly. So now, of course, they don't include any of that in the journal article. They don't say, wow, we tried this again and again. We were so sure of ourselves. It was crushing when it didn't work, and we got so excited when it did. None of that is included in the journal article. And it's for sure not included in the textbook that just tells you the bare fact of it, right? They don't even, in the textbook, they don't even tell you how they came up with this fact, typically. They just say, it is true that, blah, blah, blah. In the journal article, they give you the science fair model or the linear model of how they came up with it, as though they knew ahead of time what they were going to find. They leave out all the messiness, all the failed attempts, all the technical glitches, and all that. So the further you get from the textbook knowledge and the closer you get to the actual practice of science, the more you see this kind of ambiguous complexity that involves things like caring passionately about the thing that you're studying. So no wonder people come away with this linear model of science when they're exposed to the textbooks rather than the actual practice. So textbook facts are the most polished, finished product in the kind of scientific process, right? So when you got a fact into a textbook, it's not just like something that we're kind of sure of. It's not something that we're like, maybe. Textbooks are where we enshrine the most well-established facts. Journal articles are where people publish facts that they're pretty sure of, they have a good argument for, but they're not positive about. And then scientific conferences, preprints, or just in their own sort of lab notebooks, it's even messier and even less clear. So if you want to understand science deeply, it's not enough to just focus on the textbook, because that's the finished product. You have to understand the whole process that produced that textbook fact. And if you want to do that, Grinnell argues, and I think I agree, you're going to have to get into the messy bits. So where does that leave us with respect to objectivity? If scientists do research full of passion, trying things over and over again, sure of themselves, despite not having finished the experiment yet, is that really free of bias? Is that process free of bias? Well, Grinnell thinks kind of no, that bit of the process is not. We'll get deeper into this next week when we talk about the credibility cycle, the more complete process. But one response would be to say, no, actually, it's not free of bias. Maybe you want to sit sort of, if you've looked carefully at how actual science is actually practiced and you see it's full of passion and commitment and all of these sort of human emotions and values, you might want to say, no, what that means is science is just like all the other ways of gaining knowledge. It's deeply human. And that brings you to what you might call relativism. So that there's not just one way of gaining knowledge, or that one way of gaining knowledge isn't better than any other. So this is the exact opposite of that thought that I started this video with, that there's something special about science. A relativist says, no, there's nothing special about science. What we have are a bunch of different ways of coming up with beliefs. None of them are particularly better than any others. Now, Grinnell's going to admit that there is passion and values and intuition and all of this stuff deeply woven into, but the individual scientist to the world studied cycle. So that part of the conversation, the discovery cycle, is profoundly infused with values. But he thinks that this other half of the cycle, the credibility cycle, or the other conversation, the credibility cycle, is one of the ways in which we help to reduce the impact of biases that the individuals might have. So he's going to argue, actually, that if science, to the degree that science is objective, it's objective because it's a social process, right? The means by which we generate scientific objectivity is by having a scientific community that's organized in the right way, a kind of organized skepticism. Well, when we're talking about things that are social products, most of what comes to mind are things that are kind of arbitrary. So like, why does the salad fork go outside of the dinner fork? People kind of just decided that that's how it went. And you can easily imagine it going the other way around. And any other way of arranging things probably would have been just as good. So if scientific knowledge is a social construction, that is the result of a social process, does that mean that preferring science over any other way of producing knowledge is a kind of arbitrary choice as well? That's what the relativist would think. So Grinnell thinks that this is wrong. He disagrees with that view. He disagrees with the relativists. One way of talking about relativism is the postmodernists. That's a tricky term, but he thinks that even though science is a social process, its results are not arbitrary. That is, it's not just that we could have chosen some other way of producing knowledge that would have been just as good. He gives us a really nice metaphor for thinking about this. He asks us to imagine 3 different types of umpire. So umpire number 1 says, I call balls and strikes as they are. So the umpire, of course, is in baseball, where the job of the umpire is to say whether something was in and therefore is a strike, or out, therefore is a ball. And you might imagine somebody say, I call them as they are. Now, this umpire is a little naive, frankly, because everybody makes mistakes. This is somebody imagining, so this is like the linear model of science, somebody imagining that there's no possibility of bias in their process. There's no way that they could be wrong. They're just, I'm sure that I'm right. So this is like the overly simplistic, this umpire is like the overly simplistic picture of science. Imagine a different kind of umpire. The second one says, I call them as I see them. So this umpire is like the more complex version of science that Grinnell's going to try to get us to see. I call them as I see them. So this umpire is doing their absolute best to accurately represent reality. But they admit that it's not simple, it's not straightforward, and there is the possibility of error or bias or something like that. Now imagine a third type of umpire that says, what I call them is what they become. Now this is like the postmodernist or the relativist who says, look, this is all just a game anyway, and when I say that something is true, that's as good as it being true. Or there's nothing over and above what we say is true, right? So a relativist would say, of all the ways of generating knowledge, there's no way of preferring one over the other, so one way is just as good as any other. So what I say, when science says something's true, it's true for science, fine, but if some other way of producing knowledge says it's false, then it's false for that way. And Grinnell wants us to reject umpire 1 and umpire 3. So umpire 1 is that naive, I can't be wrong person. Umpire 3 is that, whatever I say goes, right? This is kind of just a power play. So for the postmodernists, insisting on your way of doing things is really just imposing yourself arbitrarily. It's like insisting that there's no other way. If somebody yells at you for putting at the dinner fork outside the salad fork, they're kind of just imposing their power on you, right? And there's not some objective reality that corresponds to. It's not like there's a fact out there in the universe about where the forks should go. This person's just yelling at you to get their way. So the postmodernist is kind of accusing people who insist on science as being special of doing that. They're saying, if you think science is the only way to get knowledge, or the best way, or a special way, all you're really doing is imposing your kind of culturally specific way of doing things on everybody, and that's cruel and unnecessary. Grinnell thinks that's wrong. Grinnell thinks there is something special about science, that science produces knowledge in a way that's unlike other ways of producing knowledge. But it's not a simple, straightforward, can't be wrong kind of way. It's the best attempt that anyone can make at getting at the truth while admitting that we're imperfect at this stuff. So that's the kind of umpire number 2 is who Grinnell's going to try to convince us we should think about science in terms of. So he's going to argue, to kind of review, that science is not a simple and direct road to truth. It's imbued with human interests, human values. In both parts of these two conversations of science, between the individual and the world, between the individual and the research community, both of those are soaked in values and therefore potentially vulnerable to bias. But it's not some arbitrary power game. It's not just people imposing themselves arbitrarily on others, demanding that they believe what I believe just because I'm bigger and stronger than you. Rather, done properly, it's people's best honest attempt to get at what's out there in the world, the objective truth. And we can't pretend to already have it, and we can't pretend it's a straight road to get there. Because when you start pretending it's a straight road to objectivity, that's precisely when you become umpire number 1 and say, look, I just know what's true. So what makes science less vulnerable to that is precisely this second conversation, the part that they left out of your high school science fair, the conversation with the community. And having the community organized properly, by which he means sensitive to criticism, open, but interested. That's how you get science to be as close as we can get it to objective. So objectivity, in this sense, he's going to argue, is a social product. It's something that we produce between each other, not something that one individual can bring out into the world. Okay, so that was his overall picture. So he's going to develop it in some more depth throughout the next couple of chapters that we'll read over the next couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to zoom in on this discovery cycle. So we're going to look more closely at the relationship between the individual scientist and the world, or more properly, sort of research group and the world. The week after that, we'll do the credibility cycle. Thanks.